This is Richie Venton, Scottish Socialist Party Trade Union Organiser. Since being elected, Starmer's Labour have proven what we warned they would be, that they're the continuity Conservatives, that they're capitalist Labour. We've seen already that Starmer and company have lost no time in getting stuck into pensioners, kids' benefits, disability benefits now are next in their sights, and also, of course, because foreign policy is a natural extension of the class nature of domestic policy, Labour has continued to offer unstinting support and arms to the murderous Israeli regime, especially since it's unleashed a new escalating slaughter of people in Gaza, in the West Bank, and now in Lebanon, with the sickening scenes of live-streamed episodes of Israel burning people alive. That's why Starmer cannot be trusted for ordinary people and why he's plummeted in his popularity polling, where, with the exception of Liz Truss, who infamously was outlasted by a lettuce, no British Prime Minister has ever suffered such plummeting popularity in such a short time. Several polls put him at minus 36 in his popular rating amongst the population, and that makes him even more unpopular than the loathsome monster racist Farage. As they prepare for their budget, Labour has been singing two tunes, but both of them are actually hymns to continued capitalist inequality. First of all, they've given us all a daily dosage of gloom and doom about the fact that there's no money, that there's a black hole of 22 billion, which has now all of a sudden become 40 billion, and that therefore there is no alternative but to carry out savage austerity in the course of their budget in a week or so. The other tune that's begun to be sung by Starmer, Rachel Reeves and the rest of their parrots is that we're going to open up Britain to business, that they're going to rip up bureaucracy, rip up red tape in order to unleash growth. That was the tune sung by Starmer at his recent international investment conference, where the assembled profiteers were reassured they could make fabulous wealth if they invested in Labour's Britain. Now, on the question of the black hole, first of all, a couple of points. Whether it's 22 billion or 40 billion, we should keep this in perspective. The fact is that Britain suffers such grotesque inequality that on the one hand, that kind of savagery would mean monstrous cuts to the living standards of the average person, the average working class or even middle class person in Britain and Scotland. It would mean terrible cuts to services and or tax rises to workers disguised through the method of what they call fiscal drag, where tax thresholds are frozen. But, on the other hand, the total financial wealth in Britain that's held in the hands of a few billionaires and millionaires is actually £15 trillion. That's 15 million. So 22 billion of a black hole, so-called, is a mere 0.14% of that sum. Or even if you take the newest declaration by Reeves of a 40 billion shortfall, then that's still only 0.25% of the total financial wealth held in the hands of a few individuals in Britain. The point being, there's plenty of scope for taxing the rich to fill that black hole. But of course, that's anathema to Labour, who are capitalist Labour and have absolutely no intention of taking substantial wealth of the rich. Instead, they'll attack the working class and the lower middle class. And on this question of opening up Britain for investment to unleash growth, well, first of all, when Starmer talks about ripping up red tape, working class people would be well advised to remember that red tape is better than red bandages. When you look at experiences like Grenfell, the deaths at work, and the dire lack of workplace health and safety that the COVID pandemic highlighted, those are warnings of the consequences of unbridled, deregulated capitalist profiteering, which is actually what Starmer is offering these international investors. And then we take a couple of examples of the people who are going to be benefactors of Starmer's plans to open Britain. One of them is Australia's Macquarie, who have pitched for a £20 billion investment in offshore wind and in particular electric vehicle charging networks. Wind is not the only natural element that this outfit exploits for profit. In 2006, they took a 48% stake in the privatised Thames Water Company. And then 11 years later, in 2017, they sold it after having extracted £879 million in dividend payments to their shareholders. £870 million dividends. Now, in their first year of handing out those sums to rich shareholders, the handouts were actually 3 times Thames Water's profits. So how did they manage that? By borrowing, by lumbering Thames with debt that doubled to £11 billion in the period that Macquarie had their shares in that company. That's led to a state of near collapse for the water consumers and those who suffer sewage-stricken rivers, where sewage is pumped out by Thames as a result of being saddled with debt and not being able to invest in improvements and protection of the systems. Another example that highlights Labour's priorities being the protection of the interests of the capitalist class and not of workers and their communities is the way in which Starmer slapped down his own Transport Secretary, Louise Haigh, when she dared to mildly chastise P&O for being a rogue outfit, a rogue employer. Now, let's recall, that's the gangster outfit, P&O, which sacked 800 ferry workers by Zoom and replaced them with dirt cheap labour. And then their chief executive, Peter Hepplethwaite, didn't hesitate to admit in front of the parliamentary inquiry that he quite knowingly broke the law in doing that and that he would do it again. He was rewarded for his illegal profiteering and brazen law-breaking with £183,000 of a bonus on top of his £325,000 salary. And P&O owners, DP World, were rewarded for these antics with the opportunity to profit from investment in Thames Freeport, a £1 billion investment which they then threatened to withdraw. They froze it when Louise Haigh, the Transport Secretary, told a little bit of the truth about them being a rogue employer. And they only unfroze that stake in the Freeport when Starmer disowned his own minister. In other words, big business dictates the policies of the government, and even the mildest criticism from within the cabinet is disowned and rubbished by the Prime Minister, who's out to entice and seduce capitalist investors in Britain as he opens it up and rips up so-called red tape in order to seduce them into profiteering. I think that what we would be better to do in this society is to take the wealth into the hands of the people, into the hands of a few people that happen to be billionaires and multimillionaires. In the budget, instead of what the Labour Party will be doing, the Scottish Socialist Party is advocating, including on the streets in a day of action on the 26th of October, we'll be advocating that they should tax the rich instead of marauding the population with cuts and tax increases to ordinary people. They should tax the rich in a number of forms. If, for example, they introduced even a mild wealth tax on the millionaires and millionaire couples of 5%, then that would raise £260 billion. £260 billion compared to their claims of 22 billion or 40 billion of a black hole. Imagine what that could do for investment in green jobs instead of slashing jobs at the likes of Grangemouth or in the North Sea. Imagine what it could do for wages such as a £15 minimum wage for all workers aged 16 or over, or to introduce the best pensions and benefits in Europe instead of having the worst. Imagine what it could do to expand health, education, council house building and expanded public transport free at the point of use. That's just one example of the kind of taxation of the rich that could be introduced if there was a socialist government. Another example is the fact that income tax on the very rich people has been more or less halved compared to when Thatcher took office in 1979. The top rate then was 83%. Now, at the very highest, is 45%. That should be reversed, that halving more or less of income tax on the rich. Another example is the fact that the profits of big business have rocketed, for example, by 30% since the COVID pandemic. That's the average increase on profit for big businesses. Shell, 279 billion. BP, 189 billion. HSBC Bank, 31 billion. Tesco's, 61 billion. Those are examples of the obscene profiteering, which, of course, are not taxed to any substantial degree. Britain currently has the lowest taxation on profit for big business of virtually any country in the Western world. And that is because it's now 25%. Labour has declared as one of their first declarations that they'll keep it at that level. They'll freeze corporation tax whilst increasing tax on skilled or semi-skilled workers. But it used to be 52% before the hated Maggie Thatcher took office in 1979. The Scottish Socialist Party believe that halving of corporation tax should be reversed, and that in itself would raise as an absolute minimum of £85 billion in a year. Imagine the impact that could have on public services, wages, and the society that we live in. Those are some of the measures that the Scottish Socialist Party advocate instead of what Labour is going to do in its budget. We're demanding that they tax the rich and take profits into public hands instead of leaving wealth in the hands of a few billionaires and millionaires. But of course, Labour will do nothing of the kind, and that's why we need to build a socialist alternative. We'll be out on the streets campaigning for that alternative on the 26th, just prior to the budget that Labour is poised to introduce, and I hope others will join us in demanding an end to Labour's austerity, an end to capitalist Labour's austerity, and an end to their profiteering for big business, which will mean an absolute Klondike for the rich, but misery for millions. So join the fight for socialist measures instead of Labour's capitalist austerity.